Yeah, and then of course we saw what happened to John F. Kennedy, who also he wasn't a socialist, he wasn't like a diehard anti-imperialist, but he did want some kind of restraint. He was thinking about ending the war in Vietnam, peace with Cuba, potentially peace with the Soviet Union, and we saw the consequences. I mean, even for that matter, we saw what happened when Nixon pursued détente with the Soviet Union and normalized relations with China. I mean, it's simply not tolerated. But another point that C. Wright Mills had made, of course, he wrote *The Power Elite* in 1956, and he died in 1962. So he died before he could see a lot of these things that he accurately predicted. But he emphasized the role of crackpot realism in threatening World War III. And I think we can see this very clearly today, where we're on the precipice of something like a World War III. We see that the U.S., the European Union, and NATO are basically waging a kind of war on Russia, a proxy war via Ukraine, an economic war. The U.S. is now trying to start a war with China over Taiwan. And as far back as the 1950s, we saw that C. Wright Mills was warning about this arrogant imperialist attitude, the idea of crackpot realism, and how it could in a very real way threaten World War III.
Yeah, the part of the causes of World War III, he states this very clearly. He says the causes of World War III will be the preparation for World War III. And he wrote that in 1958. And everything that he describes was pretty much came to pass in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was just kind of a miracle that it didn't lead to a nuclear exchange, and luck. It was luck and the determination of Khrushchev and Kennedy, and then some of the people around them, and even some people on the ground. Vasily Arkhipov, the political officer on a submarine that the U.S. was dropping depth charges on, and so on, something like that. And they had a nuclear warhead, and they thought that the war had already broken out. And so one of the guys was going to launch the nuclear missile, a tactical nuke that would have taken out a lot of U.S. Military forces there in the water, and likely led to a nuclear exchange. And there were already nukes on the island that the Soviets didn't tell the U.S. about. There were tactical nuclear weapons there that would have been used in the event of an invasion. They were authorized to use. The U.S. didn't know this, so people like LeMay were like, "We'll invade." And then Kennedy says to LeMay, "Well, what do you think they'll do if we invade?" And LeMay says, "Nothing." Right? But we know now that that would have led to nuclear war. Those guys almost got everybody killed. Curtis LeMay almost, ended human civilization. Perhaps you would have had a nuclear exchange, perhaps nuclear winter. None of us, we wouldn't be here today if LeMay had prevailed, and really everybody in the Kennedy group of people that were advising, except for Kennedy himself and Robert Kennedy and Robert and McNamara, who was following Kennedy's orders. And this gets resolved when Robert Kennedy talks to a Soviet ambassador or sort of go-between, and says, "My brother's not sure that if this persists, he won't be overthrown by the military." That's what they told me. He said, "These guys are nuts. They could stage a coup against my brother. He's under a lot of pressure." And they try to get the message out to the Soviets that this is not entirely under the control of the president, and things could spiral out if we don't come to some sort of understanding here. And in the end, it was damaging to Khrushchev. Khrushchev was seen as, I think they said he shit the bed, like what one of the communists said about him in the Soviet Union. And he gets removed shortly after this. It's sort of perceived as a failure on the part of Khrushchev. And with Kennedy dead, when Kennedy gets killed for this, I mean, this Bay of Pigs thing, the Cuban Missile Crisis business was all considered the last straw. I mean, when he was talking about how there could potentially be a 7 days in May scenario in the United States, he says, well, if there's a Bay of Pigs event, the military might start asking some questions. And then if there's a second Bay of Pigs, they may start asking more. Is this guy right for the job? And then if there were a third Bay of Pigs, well, who knows what they might do? And who knows what part of democracy they would claim to be serving, right? He says all these things, and this has to be thought of as a third Bay of Pigs for these people. On top of the fact he was talking about ending the Cold War, he was saying explicitly, we do not need a Pax Americana based on American weapons of war, okay? That is as succinct a refutation of the American, post-World War II creed as you could come up with. And then he gets his head exploded for these things, for confronting these people, even though they really should all be thanking them. And, they owe their lives to people like LeMay and LeMay's grandchildren, like if LeMay had his way and he carried the day, we'd all be dead, or we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have been born. But this is the power of this regime, and how you can institutionalize crazy and, let's just say, evil ideas, and they can prevail to the point that, like, no, that reasonable ideas can hardly get a word in edgewise. Like, I think that describes it. And it almost led to World War III, and the same thing is sort of happening now. The idea is like this mindless expansion of U.S. power to as far into the former Soviet sphere of influence as possible brought us to the Ukraine war. I mean, you put missiles all over the place, expanded NATO up to the borders, tried to take over the Middle East, tried to go into Central Asia. You know, the whole 9/11 global war on terror really is related to this whole expansion of U.S. military power, an attempt to get hegemony over Eurasia, and they failed. And their nightmare is coming true as far as like Eurasia and the Belt and Road Initiative uniting all these things, but like they don't have a plan B because they never wanted to accommodate other countries to allow other peoples to prosper. And this is the power of these ideas. When all the money and power is flowing into certain circles and certain people with the different mindset of like dominance and wealth, then they can institutionalize it and make it. They can create this whole cosmology that if you don't accept it, you're never going to rise into a position of power. And so the power structure can become, close to 100% rotten, a few outliers notwithstanding. The saving grace potentially is that these people are human. It's easy to point out their inhumanity and to focus on it, but they are human, and we have to hope that at some point, if it comes down to it, that may prevail rather than it not prevailing and us leading to a nuclear confrontation that'll kill us all.